The Viaduct de la Trave had stood for more than 150 years, its arches stretching like a ribcage across the gorge. Trains passed daily over its stone back, steel wheels shrieking in echo. Yet the bridge itself spoke more quietly, in the whistle of wind through its openings, in the slow crack of limestone yielding to seasons. In 2022, the engineers came not to destroy but to reinforce. Steel scaffolds wrapped around the piers like cages. Pneumatic drills buzzed into old joints, filling voids with modern cement. For days, nothing happened beyond the ordinary racket of repair. And then, as one drill pushed deeper into the southern pier, stone dust poured out, and the bit fell into a darkness no blueprint had shown. Behind the wall was a cavity, and in that cavity were bones. The workers froze. One man muttered unsanguinely, "A boar," but no boar left ribs so neatly curved. No boar wore a belt buckle. What they saw was unmistakable, a human skeleton, folded into the stone as if the bridge itself had eaten and preserved it. The foreman ordered silence. Then phones were already out, the rumor already running down the scaffolds like fire. By the time police sealed the site, the word cadavra had already reached the tavern in the village below. From Lyon came specialists, gendarmes in dark uniforms, forensic anthropologists in white coveralls. They crawled into the hollow with lamps. They lifted each bone as if it might still feel. There was no flesh left, only mineral-dry whiteness, dust compacted around wool fibers. Yet among the debris lay objects that told a story: a rusted buckle, a strap fused with lime, and a brass medallion so corroded its saintly figure was barely discernible. It bore one word in Gothic script: protégez-moi. When the archivists searched the departmental records, the name surfaced: Etienne Vardon, born 1831, builder's mate. His entry in the 1863 roster of workers was lined through in black ink: absent sans prévis. Presumed enfui. Absent without notice. Presumed fled. The discovery carried engineers and journalists back a century and a half. They asked, who was this man, and how did the bridge become his coffin? The story of the viaduct began in the 1850s when the company du Midi won the contract to drive a line south. The gorge of the Trave was a problem: too wide for timber, too deep for earth embankments. Stone arches were chosen, a design both monumental and practical. Quarries opened, blasting echoed in hills that had never heard dynamite before. Hundreds of men poured in from nearby villages and distant departments, carrying their lives in sacks. The work was brutal. At dawn, a bell rang and men filed from their barracks, long wooden sheds that smelled of tobacco and damp wool. They carried tin mugs of chicory coffee, bread hard enough to break teeth. The day's rhythm was endless, hauling blocks with winches, mixing lime mortar that burned skin, balancing on scaffolds where one slip meant a scream and a silence. Overseers kept ledgers with numbers, not faces. Wages were docked for lateness, tools broken, accidents blamed on carelessness. A man's life was worth less than a cart of stone. Among them was Etienne Vardon. He was 32 in the spring of 1863, born in the Ardèche Hills, son of a cooper. His hands were broad and cracked, his body compact but wiry from farm and workshop. He had come for steady wages, a chance to escape the small circle of vineyard and barrel. He brought with him little: a wool jacket patched at the elbows, a pewter spoon, a tiny notebook in which he copied verses though he read haltingly. Around his neck hung the brass medallion his mother had pressed into his hand before he left, whispering, "Protégé toy. Protect yourself." Colleagues remembered him as quiet, but not sullen. He hummed work songs, old refrains about rivers and loss, to keep rhythm with his hammer. He washed his hands before eating, a strange fastidiousness among men who wore dirt like skin. He was known to stop and study arches as they rose, as if trying to memorize the shape of strength. The bridge consumed men. One fell from scaffolding, a shadow against stone. Another was crushed under a pulley when rope split. Injuries were constant: lime burns, broken fingers, lungs blackened by dust. Priests came often to bless the site, sprinkling water that hissed on hot stone. Women from the village carried baskets of bread and washed linen at the river, their chatter carrying up to scaffolds. Life and death interwove until men stopped telling the difference. In March of 1863, Etienne quarreled with an overseer over wages withheld. Witnesses later said the dispute was brief but heated. He wanted pay for hours fetching water. The overseer laughed. That night, Etienne sat outside the baraque sharpening his knife, not angrily but methodically, sparks flicking in the dark. Someone asked if he meant to leave. He shook his head and said nothing. Then, one damp evening in April, he disappeared. The last sight of him was at dusk, carrying buckets from the river. By morning his bunk was empty. His jacket lay folded on the plank bed. His tin mug sat by the door. The ledger struck his name: absent sans prévis. The overseer announced he had run away, perhaps to Marseille, perhaps to the colonies. The men shrugged. Labor was transient. Disappearance was ordinary. Yet whispers crawled the scaffolds. A cry had been heard by the southern pier that night, cut short. Someone swore he saw a lantern drop into darkness. Another said Etienne had been drinking and stumbled into wet lime. No search was ordered. No one walked the gorge to look. To lose a man was cheaper than to halt the work. But memory is not so efficient. In the tavern by the river, talk lingered. 1 hour gone. A woman swore she saw a figure pacing the bridge after midnight, his medallion glinting. Children dared each other to call his name under the arches. For a while, people muttered about him as if he had been swallowed by the viaduct itself. Then, as months passed, silence fell. The bridge was finished in 1865. Trains crossed, whistles echoing. Men scattered to other sites, other dangers. The barracks were torn down. Etienne Vardon remained a line in a ledger, a bunk filled by another, a rumor folded into the stone. The cavity opened in 2022 had undone that silence. Forensic lamps illuminated ribs pressed against limestone. The skull tilted, as if listening. Dust held the imprint of cloth. The brass medallion, corroded but legible, lay where a chest once rose and fell. Engineers stood back from their scaffolds, suddenly aware that they were not just repairing stone, but disturbing a grave. The bridge crew watched the specialists work with a care that made time slow. Each bone was brushed and lifted, logged with a number on a plastic tag that looked indecently modern against the 19th century. The foreman stood with his arms folded tight, the way a man stands at a funeral for someone he never met, but whose tools fit his hands. One of the welders crossed himself when the skull came out, a reflex from a childhood he claimed he didn't remember. The cavity was measured with a laser, the depth plotted. Someone muttered that the pier had a heartbeat now. You could feel it in your fingers on the stone. What the forensic report offered was austere. Adult male, 30 to 35, stature estimated from tibia length at 168 to 171 centimeters. Healed fractures in 2 metacarpals suggesting old work injuries. Spinal were consistent with habitual lifting. No peromotum fracture. No blade or bullet trauma. Dentition showing grit, lime dust, and the poverty of sugar. Chemical traces in the bone matched 19th century lime mortar. The brass medallion, protégé-moi, was photographed where it had rested, then swabbed and bagged. A belt buckle and 2 buttons came out with it, greened by time into the color of olives. The police file acquired a modern spine. A detective from the Brigade de Recherches took statements from the crew. Their sentences seemed to belong to a single mouth. It was just there when the drill broke through. We thought it was a bore at first. The skull was looking toward us. The detective visited the archives and pressed his fingers lightly to the roster page where the black line crossed a name. In the overseer's notebook he found, Tuesday, cloud. Verdun absent. Lime short. Men complain. He copied it and put the copy in a clear sleeve as if lamination could change the past. Engineers, who had come to pour steel and certainty into old stone, stood in the awkwardness of contingency. Their reinforcement plan was redrawn. No more injection at the southern pier until the archaeologists were satisfied. The site safety officer updated his risk register with a line no one had ever expected to write. Discovery of human remains. Work paused pending judicial authorization. A drone operator flew the gorge and stared at his screen longer than he needed to. The arches looked different when you knew that inside one of them a man had waited a century and a half for a drill bit to find him. The first week brought headlines. The second brought visitors. They parked by the levee above the gorge, stood at the fenced overlook, and tried to assign a particular stone to a particular bone. It could not be done. The bridge took the attention and turned it into echo. A thin woman in a denim jacket sat on the guardrail and cried for a man she'd never heard of until breakfast. An old mason from a nearby village unfolded a newspaper clipping from 1968 about a worker who'd fallen off scaffolding on a different bridge, smoothed it on his knee, and told anyone who would listen that he still felt the rope burn on his palm when he dreamed. The gorge held every voice and made them small. 2 documents, dusty and stubborn, moved the story closer. The first was a yellowed letter in a parish box, dated April 1863, signed by Abbé Solas, to the prefecture. I am obliged to inform you that a man lodging among the bridge workers has not been seen since Wednesday last. Several men say he went south. Others say there was a cry near the 4th pier. I have said Massachusetts. The second was a scratchy paragraph from Le Courrier du Midi, May 3, 1863. We are told that certain workers, discontented with wages and discipline, have left the great works on the Trave. 1V, from Ardèche, is said to have fled under cover of night. The viaduct progresses nevertheless. Neither wrote his full name. Both seemed to bless the overseer's line with ink. A historian from the university came with students, thin pencils, and a willingness to imagine. She lectured at the roadside as if speaking into wind could alter a ledger. She explained how 19th century crews built arches on timber centering that rose like rib cages in reverse, how lime slaked and set, how hollow pockets could remain if mortar bridged and never filled, how such a pocket could embrace a man. She was asked the question everyone asked without wanting the answer. Could someone have sealed them on purpose? She looked at the pier, then at the faces, and said the only sentence that did not lie. Yes, and also no. Accidents were common. So was cruelty. The village did what villages do when confronted with old loss. It assembled. The council hall smelled of varnish and wet coats. The mayor, who had expected to talk about drainage and wild boar, talked instead about a plaque. A schoolteacher suggested an annual visit with children to speak a name aloud on the bridge. A retired railman asked if the trains would slow when they crossed the span where he had lain, not because slowing would change anything, but because rituals make sense where reasons fail. A woman who cut hair on Tuesdays and Thursdays said she had a fragment from her grandmother's mouth, that one of the bridge men had a good voice and sang about salt when he worked. And did anyone else remember that? Silence, then 2 nods. Small history acquired a tremor. The remains were transferred to a lab in Lyon for final conservation. The medallion's face was cleaned enough to see a faint oval and the sliver of a halo. A conservator read the Gothic letters under a microscope and smiled at the ordinariness of the imperative, "Protect me," pitched now at stone and time. She set it in a dish lined with felt and wrote its catalog number with a pen so fine it looked like hair. When she went home, she could not stop looking at the varnish on her dining room chair. It had dried the same dull way as the lime. In July, a small human thing occurred that did more for the case than any press conference. A man from Grenoble telephoned the prefecture and said that his grandmother had told him stories of a great-uncle who worked on a bridge and never came home. No name, no place, just ingenue in her mouth like a stone. He came the next week with a cardboard box of photographs and a baptism record that named an Etienne born to a Vardon in 1831 in a hamlet with a name the detective had to ask him to repeat twice. There was no chain of custody a court would bless, no DNA a lab could find in bones scoured by lime and time. There was only the economy of plausible love, the way a family can carry the weight of a void from kitchen to kitchen until someone offers it a geography. The prefect signed a letter with careful language. After consultation with archives and specialists, it is probable that the remains recovered from the Viaduct de la Trève are those of Monsieur Etienne Vardon. Probability carried more mercy than certainty this time. The burial was set for August. The bones were arranged in a modest oak coffin, not because the living wished to pretend they could put a man back together, but because the gesture made it easier to speak. The medallion was placed on the cloth at the chest. The buckle lay beside. A folded copy of the ledger page, with the line through his name, was included in a pouch because the family asked and the archivist, surprisingly, agreed. A priest spoke briefly about work and about the dignity of materials. He had the good sense to avoid preaching resurrection to a crowd that understood arches better than angels. A rail engineer in orange stood at the back and wept into his sleeve and said later he didn't know why. A mason ran his fingers over the headstone's fresh letters and pronounced them straight. A child wanted to see inside the coffin and his mother said no, and then yes, and then lifted him, because some questions deserve an answer even if the answer is only wood. After the burial, the museum in the departmental capital mounted a case with 3 things: the medallion, the buckle, and a photograph of the bridge. There was also a little typed card that said, "Recovered from the southern pier during reinforcement works, 2022. Associated by archival probability with Vardon, Etienne, born in 1831, builder's mate." The viaduct opened 1865. People stood in front of the case longer than in front of the paintings. The medallion, which would have been small and unremarkable on a chest in 1863, looked like a relic in 2022. A boy cupped his hands against the glass as if to warm it. Meanwhile, the engineers returned to the column. The cavity, documented and emptied, was refilled with a mixture designed to flex and forgive. Before the pour, the site manager allowed a minute for silence. Not a minute of pomp, a quiet so the crew could decide for themselves what they were looking at. Someone placed a green enamel mug, really a thermos cup, on the scaffolding ledger board as a stand-in for every tin mug at every site that went cold while a man didn't come back. A welder tied a short offcut of red survey string in a bow around a rebar tie and left it there when the concrete flowed. The foreman took his hard hat off and put it back on with a jerk as if ashamed of the softness that had crept into a place of noise. Newspapers ran think pieces in the way newspapers must. One argued that the 19th century's acceptable losses were the hidden foundation of modern comfort. Another insisted that to speak of Etienne as a symbol was to take him again, to remove his body from his name and turn him into decor. A third published a facsimile of the ledger page with the black line and asked how many lines the future would draw through us. Online, 1,000 quick certainties bloomed and withered in a day. In the village, the hairdresser taped a clipping to her mirror, and every person in her chair read it while she snipped. Theories refused to stand still. At the cafe counter, the foreman swore it had to be an accident. No time, no motive, Too much risk to seal a man on purpose. Across the room, an old carpenter, brittle as a ladder rung, tapped the bar with a knuckle and said softly that a man can disappear into concrete easier than into a river when both time and power want him gone. A teacher suggested a third way, not malice, not mischance, but neglect, the most ordinary violence of all. The priest, nursing a single beer, said nothing until asked and then said, "Sometimes the sin is the speed." The detective wrote a page he never included in the file, a private closing argument with no verdict. He imagined the night. Rain worrying the boards. Lime slaked in a tub steaming like breath. A man, tired, paid less than promised, nursing an ache in the joints of his fingers, looking for a dry pocket to sit in for 5 minutes until the horn. The pocket a little deeper than it looks. A lantern swinging briefly, the wind swallowing a name. A slide of mortar. Boards moved for the next lift. The gap filled by morning with the busy future. No blow, no conspiracy you could nail to any post. Only the oldest kind of guilt. Nobody looked long enough for one man. At the end of the year, a student troupe brought a show to the village hall. It was earnest and a little clumsy and very good. 3 sawhorses stood for arches, red string for lines of force, a tin mug for the world. An actor played Etienne without speaking. He hummed old songs while carrying wood. Another read little documents in the flat tone of an office. A third was a bridge. When the show ended, the audience didn't clap at first because they had not been addressed as an audience, but as custodians. Winter laid a clean noise on the gorge. Trains went over, and their sound changed a little in the cold, tighter, brighter. The southern pier held. The reinforcement did what it was supposed to do. It made the old stone less likely to fail. If you pressed your palm to the column in January, you felt nothing but chill. Feeling nothing is what good engineering delivers. People said this was proper and right. A few, quietly, missed the sense that the pier had become a throat for stories. They went up less often, then more, then exactly as often as before, because bridges are for crossing and we cannot live at our memorials. A year later, a journalist came back to write in after. She met the engineer, the foreman, the priest, the hairdresser, the man from Grenoble with the cardboard box. She stood on the deck of the bridge when a train went over and pretended not to flinch when the rail hummed. She wrote the article like a ledger. On one side, names and times and documents. On the other side, a medallion, a buckle, a crossed-out line. The headline was not clever. It read, "A name put back." It did well, because sometimes readers are relieved to be given mercy instead of twist. What remained, as the story settled into the place stories go when no longer news, were the small rituals the living invented. The foreman looked up at the southern pier each morning. The schoolteacher took her class once a term and had them say in turn, "Etienne Vardon, present." A woman who walked at dusk paused on the levee and touched the fence post where her hand had begun to fit the wood. Twice a year, the museum staff wiped the glass over the medallion with a cloth that left no lint. Someone tied a short strip of leather, braided, brown, bright, around the fence and replaced it when sun and rain untied it. No one admitted to doing so. Everyone pretended not to notice. Sometimes, rarely, and only when the valley filled with a certain kind of weather, the wind pulled and pushed a single sustained note through the arches. It sounded near enough to singing that if you had known a man who hummed to keep rhythm with his hammer, you could tell yourself he was warming his lungs. It sounded to others like trains passing on lines that no longer exist. It sounded to the engineer like differential pressure in a minor third created by geometry and grief. It was music as factual as lime, as imaginary as guilt. In a drawer in the archives, the ledger still lies with its thin black line. The archivist, who did not cry in public or keep relish in the staff fridge, tucked a photocopy of the page in the back of her diary. On the margin, she wrote a sentence with a sting and a benediction. "We cross out what we cannot carry." The bridge carried him anyway. She closed the book and went home. If you go to the Viaduct de la Trève, you will see stone and sky and a river that keeps its own counsel. You will stand where people stand and lean where they lean. You will read the plaque and try to imagine the inside of a column. You will fail because the world spared you that perspective. If you are tempted to bend your ear to the pier, go ahead, though the cold and the lime will out-argue you. Better perhaps to say his name once, just once, as plain as a line in a register, present, and then to go and buy bread and carry it home across the small bridges of your day. What remains at the end is a handful of objects and a way of standing. A medallion that said "protect me" and did not. A buckle that closed a belt that held nothing now. A ledger with a slick of ink that did not erase the man, but only delayed his return. And a bridge that spans a gorge, carries trains, and teaches, if we let it, that the structures we inherit are made of stone and iron and the attention we owe to the names inside them.